Charcoal stained the tips of her fingers, a permanent gray smudge that Mia never bothered to scrub away. She stood in the corner of the crowded hallway, her sketchbook open, eyes darting between the architecture of the lockers and the movement of the students. She captured it all in quick, jagged graphite lines. Every spare second was a chance to translate the world onto paper. She did not notice the noise of the school until the principal stepped onto the podium in the main lobby. The announcement cut through the chatter like a blade. A citywide art competition. The prize was not just a ribbon or a title. It was a private mentorship with a world-renowned artist. Mia froze. Her pencil hovered over the page, the lead snapping under the pressure of her grip. This was the golden ticket she had been waiting for. The validation that her hours of solitude were finally going to matter. She tucked the sketchbook under her arm, her knuckles white, and began to walk toward the art room, her mind already racing. Back in the art room, the silence was heavy. Mia sat at her desk for hours, the paper before her a battlefield of erased lines and graphite dust. She crumpled a page, the sound sharp and final, then reached for another. Nothing worked. Her lines felt stiff, lifeless, lacking the spark she desperately needed. Across the room, the atmosphere was different. Chloe worked in total stillness, her brush moving with a rhythmic, fluid grace. On her canvas, a sunset unfolded over a lake. Oranges and purples bled into each other, creating a depth that made classmates stop and stare whenever they passed. Mia watched from her desk, her grip tightening on her pencil until the wood creaked in her palm. She tried to look away, but her eyes kept drifting back. A cold, tight knot formed in her stomach. It was not just frustration anymore, it was a physical weight, a dull ache that made it hard to draw a full breath. She looked at her own messy, frantic lines, then back at the glowing horizon on the easel. The gap between them felt like a canyon. She pressed her pencil into the paper, the lead snapping again, and stared at the broken tip. Her jaw locked in a silent, jagged resentment. The bell rang, signaling the start of the lunch break. The room emptied in a flurry of movement, chairs scraping against the floor and voices fading into the hallway. Mia remained seated, her gaze fixed on the back of the room. Chloe had left her masterpiece propped against the easel, the paint still wet. Catching the light from the window, Mia stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked toward the center of the room, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The air was thick with the sharp chemical scent of acrylic paint and turpentine. She stopped 3 feet from the easel. Up close, the colors were even more vibrant, the brush strokes layered with a precision that made her own hands feel clumsy. She looked around. The room was silent. No one was coming back. Her eyes drifted to a desk nearby, where a half-full water bottle sat forgotten. She moved toward it, her breath hitching in her throat. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. She stood there, frozen, her hand hovering just inches from the bottle. The silence of the room pressed against her ears. She looked at the sunset on the canvas, then back at the water. Her pulse throbbed in her fingertips. Her fingers tightened around the plastic. The bottle crinkled, a sharp sound in the dead air. She did not think. She did not breathe. With a sudden, violent jerk, she tipped the bottle. A clear stream cascaded downward, hitting the canvas with a soft, wet slap. The water pooled instantly, carving jagged paths through the vibrant oranges and deep, rich purples. The sunset began to bleed. Pigments dissolved, running together in thick, muddy streaks that dripped onto the floor. The masterpiece was gone, replaced by a chaotic, unrecognizable smear. Mia stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, her eyes wide, watching the colors lose their form. The reality of the ruin hit her like a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird desperate to escape. She dropped the empty bottle, the plastic clattering against the floorboards. The sound shattered the silence, jolting her into motion. She spun around, her boots skidding on the slick surface. She did not look back at the easel. She collapsed into her seat, pressing her back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the inevitable sound of footsteps returning to the room. Chloe returned to the room, her footsteps light until she reached the easel. She stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. She let out a soft, broken gasp, her hands reaching out to touch the ruined fabric, then pulling back as if burned. She did not look around. She simply stood there, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks, staring at the muddy smear where her work had been. Mia watched from the back of the room, her own breath caught in her throat, unable to move or speak. The next day, the competition hall was a blur of bright lights and murmurs. Mia stood on the stage, the silver medal hanging around her neck. The applause erupted, a wave of sound that washed over the room. But to Mia, it sounded like static. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces, but they kept drifting back to the empty space where the sunset painting should have been. The weight of the medal felt like lead against her chest. She stared at the empty air, the image of the ruined canvas replaying behind her eyes, turning the celebration into a hollow, suffocating echo. The silence in the bedroom was a physical weight. Mia stared at the ceiling, the image of the ruined canvas replaying in her mind like a looped film. Every shadow in the room seemed to point toward her failure. She could not sleep. She could not breathe. When the morning light finally hit the floor, she knew she had to end the cycle. Her legs felt like lead as she walked down the hallway toward the lockers. Each step required a conscious, agonizing effort. She saw Chloe standing near the end of the row, her back turned. Mia stopped, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that drowned out the school chatter. She took a breath, the air tasting like dust and old paper. She closed the distance. "I ruined your painting," Mia said. The words were barely a whisper, yet they felt like a shout in the narrow space. Chloe turned slowly. Her expression shifted from confusion to a sharp, sudden pain that cut through the air between them. Mia did not look away. She pulled her own art supplies from her bag and placed them on the table. "I was jealous," Mia added. "I destroyed your work, and I need to make it right." The art room was a sanctuary of dust and drying paint. For 7 days, they occupied the space in a silence that slowly lost its edge. Mia moved with a deliberate, quiet focus. She mixed pigments in ceramic bowls, the liquid swirling into deep, rich hues. She scrubbed brushes until the bristles were soft and clean, placing them in neat rows on the table. Chloe stood at the easel, her hand moving with a steady, practiced grace. When Mia handed her a palette, their fingers brushed and neither pulled away. The tension that had defined their interactions began to dissolve, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of charcoal and the soft dip of brushes into water. They didn't speak of the past. The conversation was entirely in the work. Mia sketched outlines, her charcoal leaving dark, precise marks that Chloe then filled with light. They worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long amber shadows across the floor. The air grew thick with the scent of linseed oil and fresh gesso. As the week progressed, the canvas began to pulse with life. They were no longer two rivals, but two hands working toward a single, shared vision. The gallery was a cavern of polished floors and hushed voices. Spotlights cut through the dim air, converging on the center wall where the new painting hung. It was a masterpiece of light and shadow, the lake surface shimmering with a depth that drew the crowd closer. Mia stood in the back, her hands tucked deep into her pockets. She watched the judges move in a slow, deliberate line, their expressions unreadable. The room held its breath. Then, the gallery director stepped to the podium. The microphone crackled, a sharp sound that sliced through the anticipation. He spoke, but the words were a blur of sound until the final name echoed off the high ceiling. Chloe. The applause erupted, a wave of noise that filled the space. Chloe froze for a heartbeat, then moved toward the stage. She navigated the crowd with a steady gait, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. As she passed the back of the room, she slowed. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Mia. Chloe offered a small, genuine nod, a subtle tilt of the head that held more weight than any speech. Mia watched her, the tension in her own chest finally beginning to loosen. The applause continued to ripple through the gallery, but it felt distant now, like the sound of rain on a roof. Mia stood still, her hands still buried deep in her pockets. She felt the fabric of her lining against her palms, a simple, grounding texture. The heavy, cold pressure that had sat in her stomach for weeks, the weight of her own deception, was gone. She breathed in, and the air felt clean, devoid of the sharp, metallic tang of guilt. She looked at the stage. Chloe stood under the bright lights, holding the award, but Mia found her attention drifting to the empty space on the wall where the painting had once been. She remembered the water bottle, the sudden splash, and the sight of the ruined colors. That memory no longer burned. It was just a fact, a part of the past that she had finally balanced. She looked down at her own fingertips, still stained with the faint dark residue of charcoal. She did not need the silver medal. She did not need the validation of the judges. She had spent 7 days in the quiet of the art room, working until her muscles ached. She had replaced destruction with creation. She had looked Chloe in the eye and owned her failure. That was the real work. The crowd began to disperse, the sound of footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Mia turned toward the exit, her movements fluid and unhurried. She was not the same person who had entered the competition, carrying nothing but the quiet, steady rhythm of her own breath.